Okay, uh, so welcome to Workshop 4, Negotiating Regional Education Agreements. We have two presenters from MNP, and I'm going to mispronounce, is it Khrystyna?
Khrystyna is fine, yeah.
Yeah, Khrystyna. Orobets, she's the manager of consulting practices at MNP. And she has a Bachelor of Business Admin degree and a master's degree in public administration. She has over 9 years experience working with Indigenous communities and assisting her clients with various activities, including development of project plans, strategic plans, stakeholder engagement, performing financial and funding analysis, and preparing written reports. There's more info on Khrystyna on our website. And Beck Walton is an analyst in the consulting practice of MNP. He has a Bachelor of Education degree from the University of Alberta and a Master's of Public Policy degree from the University of Calgary. So Beck has first-hand experience teaching in and completing projects with First Nations and Métis school jurisdictions across Alberta. And so welcome to both of you. We don't have a like 30 people or anything. So maybe would you mind if we just had people introduce themselves and where they were from? Does that make sense to you? Just
Yes,
to start off.
that would be wonderful.
Okay, so we can start with Anne Marie.
Hello.
Hi.
Ani Kanawea. I'm Anna Marie Abitong. I'm the Director of Education for Zugomuk Anishinaabe in Ontario. And I was interested in this particular workshop as we are trying to set up a table for a collective in Ontario with First Nation schools who have First Nation schools and don't necessarily send 100% of their students to provincial schools. And so we have been a collective for 5 years and now asking for a jurisdictional table, technical table to meet and discuss the future of the collective in relation to jurisdiction and education. So that's my interest. So I'm not sure when you talk about regional education agreements, I think we're boxed in to a specific mandate.
Yeah.
I'm here to see how I can get out of the box. So if you can help with
Yeah,
that,
great.
that would be really, really interesting for me. Miigwech.
So knowledge will get you out of the box. Caitlin. Caitlin. If you could introduce yourself. So we'll go to Renee St. Germain. You might know her.
Yeah, hi, Mac and Khrystyna. We do know each
Hi.
other. Good to see you. For everyone else, I'm Renee St. Germain, and I'm the Director of Education and Languages and Learning at the Assembly of First Nations.
Okay, thank you. Lisa Boyd.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Boyd. I work for the Tsilhqot'in National Government. I'm the Education Manager, ECE K-12 programs. And I just want to learn more about the education agreements. We're located in Williams Lake, British Columbia. So I work with a lot of the Tsilhqot'in communities, which is comprised of 6 communities. And we have the local education agreement with some of the communities with School District 27. Thank you.
Okay, Dakota Edwards. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, I just got here. Are we just introducing ourselves?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Dakota Edwards. I work at the Assembly of First Nations in the Languages and Learning sector as a policy analyst, and happy to be here for the presentation.
Hey,
Thanks.
thank you. Arthur Lidd?
Hi all, I'm hoping some of you remember me from about 1 hour ago. I'm Arthur Lynn with Greenfield Learning and very interested in this topic as we partner more and more with more schools and tribal councils. It's important for us to know the structure of how things work. So very excited about this. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We'll try to go back to Caitlin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Caitlin. I work with Mac and Khrystyna at MNP's Indigenous Services.
Okay. And then we have Clayton Norris, sorry.
Oh, good morning. I'm sorry, my video is patchy today because of Wi-Fi slow. I'm Vice President Indigenous Services with MNP.
Thank you. So the other thing I should note is one of the practices that we have with FNEAA is that we videotape this and we'll produce it into a video package, which will be available on our website. And we get a lot of folks viewing the website. You know, sometimes we get 100, 200 hits on our website. So I think this one will probably be very of high interest to folks. Heather, I think we had one more. Heather, reintroducing herself.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry, we came in a little late.
That's okay.
We were having some tech issues, and I'm not sure why you're seeing a pile of books. We'll try and get that fixed. My name is Heather Morasti. I'm the Senior Director of Education for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council. I'm pleased to be here, and we have been working for about 7 or 8 years on negotiations with REAs, or as we call it, the collective. So looking forward to hearing other people's experiences and answer any questions and maybe ask some questions myself.
Okay. Good to hear your voice, Heather. I'll turn it over to Khrystyna and Mac.
Thanks for the introductions. And before we go into the slides, thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, hopefully this will be helpful. It is evolving. So back in 2019 or 2018, when this was introduced, the transformation started, it was a bit different. The communications were a bit different around regional education agreements and what can be achieved through those agreements. So we thought it's important to keep your hand on pulse and really understand what to expect. Again, we've been supporting multiple First Nations, about 10 at this point. And most of them are single First Nations, but there are some aggregates as well. So we have quite a bit of experience being at those tech tables with ISK and supporting various aspects. So before I kind of jump into the presentation, I would like to just quickly introduce our team here at MNP. So Mac and I are the two representatives here, and Caitlin and Clayton. But we have a big team that's focusing on Indigenous education specifically. And so we have people that are finance experts, obviously, because we're an accounting firm, but we also have some economics and research experts. We have people that are dealing with infrastructure, where we have educators. We have a kind of a diverse team of professionals that we can pull depending on projects that we're working on. So in terms of what we do, and again, I'm the lead for the education service line, for the Indigenous education service line, but in general, this slide outlines what we do for education, and we have some funding related services which have been hot topic lately. So reviewing funding allocations, assisting with REA or other funding agreements, doing the needs assessment for First Nation to really cost out their true needs, doing the area specific cost studies and benchmarking. So yeah, the recent examples have been the transportation study, O&M study that we've conducted, and also developing some of those business cases or budget asks for submissions to ESCON Treasury Board. However, like on the core side of consulting, again, I kind of brought up that I'm not an educator myself, but we like to think that we make educators' life easier by offloading some of those and helping out with some of those administrative and operational tasks. So, you know, our area of expertise is governance and policy development, budgeting, organizational reviews, IT planning, facilities maintenance, practices assessments, emergency management planning, community engagement. We do feasibility studies, we do infrastructure need assessment. So we kind of do everything that is non-instructional in nature. So that's our core consulting services, just kind of for you to get familiar with MMP. And so these are kind of the little pins there are our clients that we work with in education space. So either boards of education, First Nation boards of education, or single First Nation education departments. So those are kind of the ones that we work with. A lot of it is in Alberta because a majority of our team is located in Alberta. That being said, we are supporting projects across the country, and we're much so a national practice. So before we jump in, and I think we can, yeah, so the question was, and I know that there are some administrators here, but we were kind of thinking if, yeah, how many of you are considering negotiating an REA? So before we start our discussion, I'm just wondering, and I've heard some are already doing it for 7 years, or yeah, negotiating a collective. Some are contemplating and just starting technical tables. So if you could answer yes or no, like, we weren't sure what to expect in terms of numbers for participants. So yeah, just, yeah, if you could click on the answers. I guess. So we don't have too many responses, 0 out of 1 answered. Is that correct? I guess we can move on, because I mean, we already heard what participants are looking to get out of this discussion. So I think we can move on. Is that okay, Leo? Sorry. Leo, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody's engaged in.
Yes, yes. So
Somebody-
I just I'm having troubles turning kind of to the next slide. Okay, maybe I should. Okay, so let's start with how it kind of all began back in 2017 and what the AFN policy proposal mentioned or stated about the regional education agreements. And so the vision was that there would be kind of 2 major phases to this transformation. And first would be the interim funding models, which would talk about provincial comparability, and that's really making sure that the funding for First Nations is provincially comparable. So it follows the provincial formulas. And the second stage was the negotiating First Nations education agreements. And this was about sufficiency. So the proposal talked about reflecting the real needs of First Nations and how the regional education agreements are meant to be that new funding formula that really is suitable to First Nations context, and again, is sufficient for First Nations to eventually achieve that outcome parity. And quite frankly, because we've been kind of in this journey with our clients for kind of since the beginning, we've seen how the language kind of has evolved and changed on ESK part. And there were some slides at the very beginning that even mentioned that, you know, regional education agreements are about outcome parity, and that it's a framework for you to negotiate incrementally those funding increases. So yeah, we've seen that, but the rhetoric has changed lately. And so this is ESK definition of the regional education agreements from their one of the current presentations, I think from September or August. So, and it's it's the same in the way that it says that it's comprehensive funding arrangements that cover all federal supports. They define roles and responsibilities for the communities and the education service providers. So to that education authority notion and education authority representing multiple First Nation. And also it it is an administrative tool to formalize the relationships between First Nations and the education service organization, and between ESK and the organization. So it is an administrative tool. We see less and less mention of funding improvements or funding enhancements as part of ESK's presentations. And we see more about REAs being about governance. So it's less about funding improvements these days, it's more about governance, and it's about formalizing those relationships. And because really, outside of the contribution agreements, this creates a vehicle for them to be able to have the funding agreement with those aggregate organizations that provides the format for it. But again, the downside is that original vision of REAs being a new funding model, or including some first steps towards that new funding model, that hasn't been the case lately. So the few changes that we observed, so the REA used the same regional funding model as the starting point. So whatever other First Nations are using in your Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario region, that same funding model is used as a starting point, which was the case originally. But again, right now, it's you have to use the regional funding model. And it is now more or less permanent. So we'll hear less about this approach being interim. It's more or less permanent. They're talking about funding adaptations, but those need to be implemented at a provincial or better national level. We don't know of any significant adaptations that have been made since 2019. And we've heard from ESK all over, again, that even though there was some budget allocated initially for those enhancements, it got eaten up by them underestimating the funding protection amounts for the block funded communities, the student eligibility increasing. So for example, in Alberta, it was 20 years old, now is 21. So their influx of those older students, and also the removal of non-rural attendance compliance requirement. So basically the fact that you used to, that only those with a certain percentage of attendance could qualify to be funded under the non-rural role. I mean, for some First Nations, this increased the number of students eligible for funding by as many as hundreds with some of the clients we work with. So long story short, there was an idea to have budget for those enhancements. Now, the reality is that they basically had no money for the past few years to action any of those adaptations or enhancement, they call them. So another a bit disappointing thing is the removing of funding stabilization. And so it is now not in the current REA template. It used to be in the REA template, and basically said, and for some nations and some groups of nations that have negotiated their REAs early on, they had a clause there saying that the funding will not go down by more than 1.5%. So this was great because the funding formula varies. In Alberta, for example, we just had a major overhaul of the formula, and it reduced the funding for First Nations. It also helps protect from those fluctuations in enrollment, which First Nations, being smaller systems, experience a lot. So that is something that they say that could potentially be reintroduced by 2022, 2023. But this was a very key component of the agreement, which unfortunately isn't there anymore. And development of that more financially stable environment is primarily interpreted as separation from chief and council. That has been our observation. So kind of ISC sees this as a vehicle to have First Nation their own independent education authority, which has merit to it, like it's not a bad thought for some communities. But yeah, so that financial stability, there's not as much talk about sufficiency anymore. Do we want to have any questions back and forth? Like if people can raise hands at any point, we also will have some room for discussion at the end. Is there anything in the chat? Okay, so kind of like seeing where this is headed. Like there was an AFN resolution. I'm sure that between Renee and Dakota, they probably will be able to say what happened to it. But AFN saw that it's not going the way it should, and so that I just kind of thought it would be important to show this resolution that from the Chiefs Assembly saying that, you know, REA should be about achieving that substantive equality. And by substantive equality, this is a very good legal term that now ISC is using in their departmental plans, but it has a lot of meaning to it. It really, substantive equality is about equal opportunities and equal service level, and we don't see it yet in education. We've seen education funding improve, but we're kind of far from substantive equality yet. So, and the resolution went further to state that, you know, it should be about identifying real costs and real needs as researched and costed by First Nations. And that, yeah, so I'm not sure, I don't think that there has been real actions on this, maybe in principle and agreement, but not much funding to support that. Okay, so I'm just gonna, doesn't flip. Okay, so in terms of REA and treaty implementation, we thought it would be important to address this because our clients like to call funding agreements treaty-based agreements and like to them be truly treaty-based. And so the REA, we've had a lot of our clients asking if they could have a treaty-based agreement instead. So in current shape and form, REAs are not treaty-based or treaty agreements. In fact, even if REAs address the funding piece well and talked about funding sufficiency the way they should have, they don't address the lawmaking authority piece. So they're not truly, they just address one aspect really, a funding aspect and some governance aspects. So they are administrative agreements and you're still under the Indian Act if you have one. And even with the treaty-based agreement, like they're not truly treaty-based if you're still under the Indian Act. So that's why we're trying First Nation to kind of guide First Nations to not call agreements that aren't truly treaty agreements, a treaty-based agreement. Like that's yeah. That being said, REA can be a stepping stone to self-government agreements in the future. So having one doesn't preclude you from having a comprehensive self-government agreement in the future, or a sectoral education self-government agreement, which removes kind of the nations from just the education sections of the Indian Act. So again, that's just to say that those aren't the same. There is a non-derogation clause even in the current template of the REA, and it is helpful because it specifies, it makes it very specific to say that there is the First Nations are free to negotiate any sort of self-government or treaty agreements moving forward. So yeah, this is kind of just a slide showing that there is interim funding formula and an act applies, and that's true treaty-based agreements, or where the Indian Act doesn't apply anymore. So REA and block or 10-year grant funding. So we've been, I think it again, because there's lots of talk about funding and how there are those different funding agreements. And so 10-year grant agreement or block funded agreements aren't the same as REA. They're funding mechanisms. So you can have an REA and a 10-year grant agreement at the same time. Renewing the block funding agreement or negotiating a 10-year grant does not increase the funding levels for education specifically. So basically, you will be funded at this using the same funding model when you're under a 10-year grant. So it doesn't change really how the education piece is funded. Now, a good piece is that 10-year grants now have an escalator, at least 2%. That being said, it doesn't apply to education because the way the formulas work, it kind of already has an escalator in place because it changed the formula calculations change based on number of students and your enrollment, and it also is being updated by the provincial government. So again, if you think about 10-year grant, and the REA, like your education funding amount doesn't really change whether or not you have a 10-year grant. Now your reporting is less. Good things about 10-year grant, but it doesn't really increase your funding level. So before we move into this, any questions?
How does capital play into, or is that a totally separate negotiation in the REA?
Capital was not originally a part of REA. First Nations were we had a First Nations that we submitted the proposals to become budget asks that talk about infrastructure. They specified at the very beginning that infrastructure could be mentioned as a future discussion piece, but it's REA is more on operational funding. And so unfortunately, at this point, it doesn't address the infrastructure. That being said, we recommend that with that funding for technical tables, you identify and cost out your infrastructure needs as well. So again, about not as optimistic about negotiating infrastructure funding, but for sure doing your background work and justifying the needs is something that can be started now.
I guess for us here, we were approved for a new school.
Yep.
And we will break ground in the spring. So we did negotiate that separately.
Yeah.
We did know that the what do they call that? The standard formula that they use
Yeah.
had some changes to it towards the end of our submission.
Mhm.
And I forget how many square feet. It wasn't much anyway in terms of square feet for add-on to the new school. So we didn't go with the newest space accommodation standards.
Yeah.
And we were with the old standard. And so rather than prolong the project and start over, kind of, we remained within the old standard that was provided. And of course,
Yeah, that's
you know,
unfortunate that you built your school. You could have probably had a better space allocation with the new standards coming up.
well, it's interesting though, because ISC at the time, we severely had identified special education classrooms in our facility. And so ISC basically stated that they wanted to do an assessment of our classroom spaces and special needs spaces. And so they hired the consultants to do the assessment for us. They were from Western Canada. And I think ISC really thought that the consultants were going to work in their favor to downsize our square footage for the building. But in this case, it actually worked in our favor, and we were able to get that additional square footage. So when you weigh it in terms of, you know, working with the old space accommodation standards, weighing it against the new one, and then the special needs resourcing additional allocation, it probably works out to about the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. It's kind of unfortunate that you didn't have a chance to hire your own consultants.
Yeah, I think
it is. Yeah, because I mean, we've
well, it was a tactic, right? It was a tactic by ISC and to minimize our project, I think. So unfortunately, it didn't work in their favor. So but we're very pleased we'll be getting the capital allocation to build a new school.
No, that's great. And I mean, like for the process for the new facilities, new schools is the same. It's under the First Nations Infrastructure Investment Plan, and it's kind of submitted at the community level first, then it kind of is being prioritized at the regional level, and then it goes to the national level. So I'm happy that you were on the top of the list there. Yeah. Thank you for those comments. Those are the components of the REA right now, and this is based on the most recent template that has been shared in September by ISC. Kind of the way ISC sees it, now you're free to add your schedules. Like it's not limiting that way. So this is what they have. So when they send you the sample agreement, this is what they have there. So there's a legal agreement that outlines the roles and responsibilities of Canada and the First Nations Education Authority or First Nation. It's not limited to the authorities. It also has a delegation agreement, which again is optional, and it only makes sense for those that have either aggregate education organization representing multiple First Nations, or we have some First Nations that are already working towards separating from Chief and Council and establishing their own independent incorporated education authority. So so the delegation agreement is for those folks. If you're still under the Chief and Council, there's no need for that delegation agreement. So then the Schedule B is a form of funding model. That's what it's called. And really what it does, it just provides that overview of regional education model that is changing year to year. And it's same for First Nations across your region. And the first one is around board responsibilities. And again, this is more applicable to those that have their own board and have their separate education authority, separate from chief and council. So, for those that are education authorities, like REA effectively replaces the funding agreement, and funding flows directly to that authority. So it does include some articles that you would see in a typical contribution agreement. So you would see financial reporting and audit, budget and debt, default assignment, all these good things. So for example, we have a nation that negotiates right now, but they're still remaining under the chief and council, so they don't have all of those general articles. So it's a shorter agreement, and it doesn't have the delegation or those other pieces that are applicable just to those that are independent from chief and council. So this is the structure of the REA, just for you to kind of take a peek. And that's what legal agreement contents are like at this point. So, I mean, the most important ones are obviously the commitments of the parties, joint responsibilities, your funding, expansion of the funding model. There for sure, like performance measures, that there are things to look at there as well. So what to look for in your agreement, and I already kind of talked about it a little bit. So if you're negotiating this agreement and you're forming the education authority, there has to be way more in the agreement about how you're going to be governed. What are the roles and responsibilities of your board of governors or your board of trustees? It also needs to say are you appointing a superintendent or a director of education? And it has way more to it in terms of governance and administration. And it also has the delegation agreement as attached to the separate schedule. So the delegation agreement would typically say that, the education authority is now responsible for all the facilities O&M and stuff like that could have been under the chief and council or under the public works department. It does vary from nation to nation, and some would just take over education specific responsibilities, and the other things like, in some cases transportation or O&M still remain to be managed by chief and council. So it's really like the nations really need to understand what governance model suits best for their unique needs. And depending on how new the organization is, and whether or not you're separating from chief and council, like the level of detail is varied. So the commitments of the parties, like this one is, I mean, the recent, the very recent template is drafted very much so in Canada's interest. And so there is about 19 different clauses, and the clauses are they keep adding those in about what First Nations education authorities need to do. And now they list things from, education services, and it specifies that your education services should be at a level that's comparable or exceeds provincial standards. There's commitment around transportation, and that you're required to pretty much provide transportation to everybody on your nominal roll, which we know for the provinces are not the case, because they only provide transportation for the eligible students that live within a certain distance from the school. So it's about like those commitments from the nations include Also, negotiating those education service agreements with provincial school boards, providing inclusive education and special education services. So all good things. And reporting is a big part, and is would love to see better reporting from First Nations in terms of student achievement, because there is no way for them to tell right now how kids are doing, how their outcomes are. So there are quite a few clauses on how you should assess student achievements and how you should report those outcomes. So again, this is all good stuff, but ISK's commitments just in the template are limited to like 3 things, and most of that is around providing funding as per the funding model for the region. So again, the way it is drafted, just that sample, and it's subject to change. It's not like it's written in stone, but this kind of demonstrate the vision for it, and like that imbalance in commitments, where First Nations are supposed to do all of these things and do them well, and they're only providing funding as per the funding model. And there's the expansion of the funding model section doesn't commit to doing things. And it's not untypical for the government to have clauses like subject to appropriation by the parliament. It is normal. There's no way around it, but it's all very not committed, and it does look very unbalanced in terms of those promises. So knowing that, we really encourage our clients to really look at what do you want to commit to, what do you want them to commit to, and so kind of moving it towards like more balanced, not like making sure it's tailored to First Nations interests as well. So and again, having a good lawyer looking through the agreement with you and walking you through it, or another expert that could really explain what that means on their side and your side is great. I would say that looking at good agreements is also something that you should do. Like, for example, a good agreement is the BC tripartite education agreement. And it is well balanced. And even though they're not there yet for all of the different things they want to accomplish, it truly is the way it's drafted and the way those commitments are laid out. It's a good agreement. It is in the good interest of First Nations. So I encourage you to look at that one and see how it's actually different from the template that's being provided.
Is that with the Nishka?
Not with Nishka. Nishka would be a self-government agreement. It's the one that covers the entire province of BC. So, and it talks, so it's FNESC, that's the group that negotiated First Nations Education Steering Committee. They represent all First Nations in BC. And they kind of negotiated this agreement with the province as well as with ISK. That's why it's tripartite. And it commits to even the budget asks, like not every funding that First Nations in BC want is in the agreement, yet it provides a good framework to work together with ISK. It provides an agreement oversight committee with ISK at the table, and they have a structure to their discussions. There is a structure for submitting budget asks. There is way more to it, and there's some real promises as well. But it's a good agreement to look at and to leverage. So accountability by ISK. So again, just working with many clients on this specific topic, it's hard to remove the subject to appropriation by the parliament. However, there are things that you can do to make it better. So for example, dispute resolution mechanism and what happens if, the parties don't get to a consensus on certain things once they have the agreement in place. There's also a funding negotiation work plan. So even though it's unlikely that ISC would commit to new funding as part of your REA at the time you sign it, but having that structure in place to say, this is how we're gonna negotiate this. This is the meeting schedule. These are the topics of interest. This is how you're gonna help us with the budget ask. And yeah, that makes it a much better agreement for you. Also, the lawyers that we've been working with always recommend including negotiation in good faith. So that good faith has a lot of legal meaning to it. And that means that they should be honest when they negotiate it, not because, like, again, back to that empty promises bit. But yeah, negotiating in good faith. So knowing what the situation is with funding, and if they say that something will be taken to the Treasury Board, it is taken to the Treasury Board, and there is a process for prioritizing those things. Like that is, yeah, those are the little tips that we recommend kind of using. And also it's beneficial to soften the language. So if say everything on the nation side is right now will provide, will do this, I encourage clients to say subject to adequate funding or subject to revisions of the funding model related to X and Y. So it's not, well, again, that's back to the balanced point. So it's not like, ISC doesn't have any commitments and you have all sorts of things that you are supposed to do. And performance measures. Again, this is something that many of our clients are reluctant to include. For many reasons, they don't want to be judged and say, hey, well, your graduation rate is still not improving, or your provincial tests, the kids are failing still. But I think it is important to include those performance measures. And I mean, ISC would love this, but it's serving the purpose for negotiation, because when you tie your asks, budget asks, to performance measures and say, hey, this is where we're at, we need this, and this is proven by research and best practices that this helps. Like, it really helps tie performance when we kind of link everything back to performance of students. So again, thinking about what's reasonable for you and coming up with your own performance measures, as opposed to kind of having ISC imposing something on you. That's something to be looked at. So bottom line, it is necessary to retain a lawyer to go through the agreement. Like, they don't really like when the lawyer, and it's not necessary, to be honest, for the lawyer to be there at all the negotiations meeting, but running the changes by them and say, hey, what does that mean? This is what ISC is suggesting, because they typically would come back to you with some comments to the document about removal of certain things or adding certain things. Again, having somebody to say what the implications are is important. So any questions at this point? Because I would hand it over to Mac, and he'll talk about funding improvements. Yeah, I guess, Mac, you're on.
All right. So yeah, a big part of moving into kind of the negotiating process is to recognize that the provincial funding models that have been applied to First Nations don't necessarily reach provincial comparability for a lot of areas. It varies very much depending on the region, but some of the common funding gaps that we've noticed still remaining for First Nations, no worries, are in operation and maintenance funding, transportation, language and culture, economies of scale is a big issue for a lot of smaller First Nations. A lot of the provincial funding models don't have adjustments related to specific circumstances, such as flying communities in all of the regions, as the provincial school boards don't necessarily have those issues. There's issues to support the development of second and third level services, specifically with First Nations language and culture development and kind of accreditation, everything, curriculum development, things like that. And then there's also gaps related to the historical underfunding of First Nations, specifically in education, that leave First Nations education jurisdictions in a bit of a deficit, and more funding is needed to kind of recognize those things. So I think we have a poll coming up related to this. I mean, we have lots of people. I know that there's some folks from the AFN who may not have that don't work for a school jurisdiction perhaps, but it'd be great to hear your opinion of which areas you guys are finding is the biggest funding gaps. So I'll just wait until I guess the results might show up for us. Is that
Yeah,
right?
you can select multiple.
How do you do that? Because it's not doing it.
And if you want to speak up and share your thoughts too, that's more than fine.
Yeah, I was unable to pick more than one. And so I picked curriculum development just because it encompasses a lot of the other points there that we could pick from. We really struggled with our negotiations with Indigenous Services Canada to get them to see where those gaps were. I think when the provincial parity, quote unquote, came down and was implemented, there was a lack of understanding of our provincial funding formula and where those gaps were. And in fact, we had to point them out to Indigenous services when we were negotiating. You know, the province has a third level service. They have a Ministry of Education that organizes a lot for that and for the provincial systems, and we don't have that. And especially when it comes with curriculum development and language and culture and all those structures, we're kind of left on our own to just do it ourselves on the sides of our desks. And I think that's a huge gap that could then relieve some stress off of our second level services, off of our schools, so they can really focus on instructional leadership. And so I guess that's why I picked curriculum development.
Sounds good, Heather.
Thanks for sharing, Heather. Yeah. Does anyone else have any comments before we move on?
Since you can only pick one, there are multiple. But yeah, interesting to hear what your top number one is. Because I mean, some of the things are consistent across the provinces and some are, because the funding models do vary quite a bit, and the total amount of funding provided is, is very different depending where you are. So just wondering there if any gaps that are, if you can name any gaps that are specific to you.
I can jump in here, and I know I didn't want to take anyone's turn in line, but one of the things I think I'm looking forward to in the future is seeing more appropriately costed operations and maintenance funding gaps, because I know that in some of the only research that we have that is First Nation specific, it kind of identifies that it looks like First Nations are receiving between 30 and 40% of what those actual needs are for O&M, and depending on the amount of schools on your nation and the type of services they provide, then those often could be in the 6 to 7 figure range in terms of funding that's missed out. So I think that'll be something prioritized, or at least looking to be improved in the near future.
Both, I would say, O&M and minor capital approach that has no rhyme to it and could be replaced by provincial approaches as well. So it's yeah, and the REA, an interesting thing that I noticed that was added just to this latest sample agreement was a commitment for First Nations to pay for all the repairs under $1.5 million. So if kind of what Bram said is true, and they're underfunded by 30–40%, yeah, and then having to cover those expensive repairs that are really because there hasn't been maintenance over the years, or there hasn't been proper maintenance, and there's this huge problem with the deferred maintenance or lack of maintenance. And yeah, like First Nations would be in big trouble with that commitment in the REA.
That's a really good point, Khrystyna, and just bringing up that insurance is a big issue as well. A lot of First Nations look at Canada's insurance policy, and REA is having that commitment for insurance for First Nations as well. And Bram, I'm surprised you didn't say transportation, but as well. Okay, so I guess we'll move on to the next slide. Looking at kind of this is another slide that's taken from an ISC presentation in September related to kind of how they see kind of the processes of negotiating and working towards improving funding for First Nations. They kind of broke it down into both a national and regional approach, where the national approach is that there's the provincial regional funding models that are applied, blanketed across First Nations with some additional investments related to language and culture in K4 and 5. I believe there's some before and after school care that is included now as well. And then just provincial tuition funding based on kind of the funding that provincial students receive at local school jurisdictions. Essentially, ISC was providing two main options for First Nations to improve their funding. First, through technical table processes, looking at the data, the actual technical formulas, things like that, to improve the framework that exists, looking at proxies that are used in the provincial funding models, as well as making sure that all information is used is correct. And then through the REA, it was identified that, as Khrystyna had mentioned, that there's no real funding attached to it. However, there was the inclusion of what was described as an REA budget ask. And these REA budget asks would be based on kind of the aggregate ask of all First Nations who have REAs, to create a thematic approach to access any remaining or additional funding in the region for education, and it essentially would provide additional funding for specific initiatives over the next year. The process for this has not been very well defined, and it's kind of designed to support things that are above and beyond what is included in the regional funding models. Whether or not that's provincial comparability or not is a whole other question, but it's kind of the process as it stands. Khrystyna, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it.
So moving into those kinds of negotiations, the most important thing to start with, I believe, is really understanding the current state of where your First Nation sits. First Nations are provided side-by-side comparisons. Typically, those were created to compare between what your previous funding were before the education transformation, and then what you would receive on what was the interim funding formulas, now the regional funding models, and kind of identifying what those changes will be year over year. Understanding what is included in the side-by-sides is really important, as for a lot of First Nations, especially those who have not consented to the regional funding model, might be on a block funding, there can be significant decreases in funding, and how funding flows to the First Nation that you're working with, or working under, and whether or not you'll receive those fundings over the next year. I think April 1st, 2023 is the year where all the regional funding models will be applied across the board. The other key component is really understanding the local provincial funding formula. The ISK technician's job is to take the provincial funding model, which is not designed for First Nations education jurisdictions, and apply it to them. And with that, they don't necessarily have all of the components and data and information they need to do so accurately. And in a lot of cases, it just doesn't, it's just not designed for the same scenario. So making sure that any of the data that is used is correct, any of the proxies are correct, and the accuracy of the data is correct. We've seen situations where huge portions of schools have received less operation and maintenance funding because areas weren't updated in the formula from years past after renovations. We've seen geographic components of provincial formulas being applied inappropriately, wrong proxies used, resulting in a projected decrease in funding of hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. So it's really important to understand both the provincial funding and the ISK narratives regarding the funding formulas, to make sure that you're starting from a strong negotiating point, essentially. Yeah, next slide.
Yeah, so that was kind of a lot of our work initially, and even so, because again, those formulas get updated, and they're kind of evolving. Like, we just had a major overhaul, and lots of proxies, different assumptions used here in Alberta. So we looked at that. There have been areas, so for example, in Saskatchewan, there were, provincial officials that we talked to in the Ministry of Education were not in agreement with ISK on how certain components are applied, and in fact they would recommend a totally different approach. And so getting their perspective was important as well. Like, it's kind of across the board where those improvements are required. And so this is the starting point for the negotiations, we believe. Like, outside of the box, like I think those comments that we want to move really outside of the box, but I would clean up the box first. I would really see if what the current application is a good way to do it. And so kind of doing that analysis is very important in our experience.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add there is making sure that you understand the nominal role requirements and maximizing what is recorded by a First Nations nominal role as just the primary driver for almost all of the formula components. I've seen situations where First Nations, all of their K4 students haven't been included in their nominal role, and so the whole side-by-sides, which haven't been agreed to, but they're missing a huge chunk of students, and ensuring that that's there is important as well. All right.
Sorry, I kind of forgot that I have
That's okay. I can't. Yeah. The next negotiation tips that we have. Second is accessing technical table funding and any other kind of funding related to structural readiness, those types of things that would support you in getting those first steps ready to negotiate with ISK, either regarding the technical table is more focused on looking at the specific components of your agreement or the provincial regional funding models. Structural
And I would
readiness.
just want to jump in here saying that regardless of whether you want to negotiate an agreement or not, I strongly recommend applying for that funding. At least like you can do that costing with that money. At least you can identify those needs. You can do some strategic planning of what those major gaps are. And yeah, so it is a good, I mean, like rarely you have funding available for something like that. I think accessing it, regardless of what your final destination with the REA is, I think is a good idea.
Yeah, and even community engagement, supporting community engagement through these funding things to make sure that you know what your community wants in terms of education, and education governance is a big piece. Keeping abreast and making sure that you understand what's going on with other First Nations, having conversations with other groups, other education organizations, kind of regionally or nationally, to understand what REA negotiations look like and how they're changing over time and in different areas.
And it also like it sets precedent, like it's really leveraging the precedents. And I'm not saying that it's always a success, but if you know that this has been done in BC or with Masquatchie's group or whatever, like you for sure there's better leverage. Or for example in Ontario, there's isolated nations that were successful in getting some additional funding specific to isolation. Like that is a precedent that could be leveraged by other isolated nations. So it's really kind of knowing, and that's why I believe like forums like this are very important, because it provides opportunity for First Nations leaders to connect on those things between themselves.
Absolutely. The next tip is really using Canada's words against them. Politicians and reports that have been developed by Canada have very specific statements regarding education and reconciliation and improving things for First Nations communities, especially regarding K-12 education. Using what every time there's an election, that doesn't change much. There's a throne speech where they'll throw in more platitudes towards improving education or moving on to the next big topic, but focusing on using those in your reports and any of your communications, it really makes a difference in terms of the kind of emotional or just holding them accountable for their promises is a really important piece as well. Next slide.
So
go ahead, Anna Marie.
Going back to slide number 1, you mentioned to access that funding.
Yeah.
Is the funding called, is it called the EEP funding?
Yeah.
The EPP, yeah. So
it's under that stream.
All right.
Absolutely.
Yes. So it's kind of like initially when this all started, it wasn't a part of the EPP. Now it is, and you can use the same DCI for the funding proposal, like that same data collection instrument, and fill it out. And the REA would just be a kind of a subsection there.
I believe that's what our group has been using to fund our process.
Mm-hmm.
But lately ISC has kind of backpedaled on that. And a lot of our activities were not approved.
Yeah. And so for education authorities, there's also, I mean, they say, and at this part of the REA states that, the education authority should develop a transition plan, and that plan will be funded. And it's funded typically through structural readiness. Like they just receive more instructional readiness funding. But again, like we have a client here in Alberta that like their structural readiness, well, they weren't done with their initial initiatives, but it kind of reduced in half basically this year, and they were like, "What? We thought this was all agreed to, and now we're getting half of what we're supposed to do." And they're managing 5 different First Nations schools. Yeah, so in different First Nations. So it's they weren't ready to be losing that.
Exactly. And of course, the excuse they
Yeah.
use is the election and I guess the appointments to cabinet, right? And they play like they don't have any information or know anything or don't know anything about funding levels. So I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I wish, and it sometimes sounds like, okay, this area is fixed, like, K to 12, done. It's not. Like, I mean, like, it's good. I mean, back in the day, there wasn't any movement on anything First Nations. So, like, I mean, the changes are good, but it just, yeah, what is frustrating is that sometimes it feels like, okay, this is kind of a check mark. We put that on education there. Yeah, too early. So Mac, you can, I guess, continue with this one.
Yeah, I number 5 is an important one. When you're looking to identify kind of enhancements to be included in either an REA budget ask or just in general for asks and kind of support through ISK, is really trying to identify key themes. A number of our clients have really focused on using their strategic planning that they've already had in place for their board to identify the key themes that they want to establish enhancements to be included in negotiations with Canada. And this is kind of what Canada is asking for. And it might be a way to really kind of prioritize your First Nations kind of issues through those processes.
And when you figure out the themes, I think to make it very clear for ISK, it has to be something that's not covered in or you have to explain how it's not covered in the formula, because they always come back to provincial comparability and would send you, oh, by the way, there's the socioeconomic piece that's supposed to address all of it, or whatever. Like, so you have to really figure out that theme, not just based on your needs. So, like, yes, using strategic planning as a starting point, but how to present it so it makes sense, and kind of it is something different from what the formula already has, or you can explain that the formula amount isn't meeting your needs, but like being specific, with them and tying it back to the formula, in our experience, has been a good approach.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I mean, an example of that in Saskatchewan, the provincial model has no specific funding for libraries, and a lot of First Nations have issues with getting library funding, and so including that in there would be something as an example.
Or curriculum development that was already brought up. Yeah, that it's nowhere anywhere in the model. So yeah.
Or any third level service.
Yeah, any third level services.
The next step is kind of building your business case for enhancements to, really tying it to the funding formula itself. Looking at really digging into the formula, having the data for the areas where the ISK is saying they don't have data is really important. Looking at your statistics, your performance measures, benchmarking, comparing it to the provincial system is a really strong, important factor in making any changes to the formula itself. And then also looking for precedents across First Nations, understanding that ISK is much more likely, and this ties into the next tip, to make changes if it's involved with more than one First Nation. They really, I mean, they call it the regional education agreements. They're wanting to move to larger kind of groups. Whether or not that's necessarily in your First Nations interest is another thing. But in terms of advocacy, really working with other First Nations or other First Nations organizations to help have a more united voice is really important. And this, with specific enhancements, it just builds the voice and increases the likelihood of success with your negotiations. In prep, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Khrystyna.
Yeah, so this is just kind of a summary of the key pieces there that you need to do in terms of the preparation for the REA, or if you're doing the REA already. So I really understand the type of governance and how you would like your governance model to look like between the band leadership and the education authority, how they would work together. Like that is very important. Like, who is the party to the agreement ultimately? Is that the chief and council, or is that the newly created education authority? Developing a vision for education and kind of corresponding performance measures, again, kind of putting that in is important. And again, like I think there's a lot of hesitancy around those performance measures, but it does help you with your business case at the end of the day. And it also, like, in terms of the funding enhancements, I would go step by step from the area that is the most urgent for you and you feel that formula doesn't cover at all, and developing a very thorough business case on that, for that theme, and then going from there, like tackling theme by theme, the way that First Nations in BC do it. And you may have heard about transportation replacement that they negotiated, or the joint transportation plans. Like it's not like they're getting all of it at once, but for every change, there is a business case, there is a clear justification, there is comparison with a province, and kind of explaining why that notion of provincial comparability doesn't make sense in your circumstance. So that kind of is the approach with the funding. And then also in terms of the legal agreement is have somebody walk you through this, not just review the final version of it. And I think many of our First Nations clients were kind of like, they were just meeting with us and then having a lawyer review the very final version, and they weren't really sure what it's supposed to accomplish. So it's kind of engaging the lawyer. They shouldn't be at your meeting, so they already said, but kind of saying to them what you're hoping to achieve, and if the agreement and the specific subsections of it, if they're aligned with what you ultimately want. So yeah, and in terms of kind of which nation may benefit from negotiating an REA, so the ones that have their block funded, so the block funded ones, and again, Mac has experience working a lot with block funded nations, so maybe you can share some of your recent takeaways from the conversations with us there.
Yeah, essentially, a lot of the block funded nations that we work with, there has been very moving goalposts on when funding protection was going to be removed. Essentially, what has happened now is that all of the funding protection that's in place for programming up to 2017-18 is going to be held in place for those nations until a hard deadline right now of April 1st, 2023. It's really important for these nations to negotiate an alternative. I mean, there are some nations that are set to lose millions of dollars in education funding when the new formula is introduced.
And for sure, though, the ones that are creating the independent education authority, like there is, this is kind of the mechanism out there that has to be used. I mean, you can tailor it to whatever your needs are, but yeah, if you're planning on creating an independent education authority that receives funding separately from the nation, like this is a tool to be used. And then also for those nations that really fall, like it's clear that they're outside of provincial comparability. And I'm not saying, I think everybody false outside of provincial comparability, but there are some that, you know, and I already brought up the example of some of the isolated nations that, yeah, and like there are really no analogs in the region for those nations, and you can really push that kind of provincial comparability envelope being expanded, and also the nations experiencing significant fluctuations in enrollment. I'm talking smaller nations typically that, you know, like losing a handful of kids or 10 kids means that you don't have a teacher anymore, or 2 teachers, like that's and have, so for those nations, it's having that stabilization clause and making sure that the funding isn't this roller coaster year to year. Because your enrollment varies so much. But this one is subject to reintroducing that stabilization clause. And I think they're thinking about it. I'm sure hoping that they'll make it work somehow, because this one, yeah, this one was the kind of the thing that I thought, even if nothing else gets negotiated, at least they have that stability. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Or yeah, anything that you kind of have been wondering about, or yeah, or would like to hear kind of either our experience or maybe some thoughts regarding negotiations or funding. And I'm wondering, even like for Heather, like were you able to negotiate any funding improvements beyond the formula, even for the things that you caught were wrong in the application?
Well, our our journey has been something, and you have definitely hit a lot of the points that and roadblocks that we've come into. What we have in our collective agreement is all those areas that you pointed out. Now, for example, they would say capital isn't part of it, transportation, all of those things, but we do have clauses in our agreement that they will in the future have to negotiate with us.
Mm-hmm.
So we
yeah,
made sure, yeah, that was in there.
That's great.
That any additional funding that's coming out, so the before and after school program funding, for example, we would just automatically get that. We don't have to renegotiate or anything like that. We have escalator clauses in it. And then also moving forward to self-governance. So we tried to put anything and everything in there. I would highly recommend that and reiterate what you said, Khrystyna, is have a lawyer look over it every single time before you sign it. Mm-hmm. We have found in the 11th hour, a couple words were changed by ISC that completely changed the understanding. And then decrease the funding significantly. And so our lawyer caught that, and you know, just a couple words made a huge difference. And we pushed back and said, no, you agreed to what was in the document in August. This is just some of the grammar changes, some editing and formatting. And now you've changed this. That, no, not going to happen. And so our lawyer caught that. Yeah, it's quite a thing. It seems like you get really close to an agreement and ISC changes the rules, and you have to go back to the drawing board. So it's have a team, have somebody on your team that knows the provincial funding model inside and out, because they can find a lot of those loopholes or areas that are missing. And yeah, I wouldn't go it alone as a director by any means. Have a team. We utilize structural readiness and then REA funding to fund that team. The unfortunate part is a lot of the proposals aren't funded or approved until October was one of our years. And then, you know, that holds you back a little bit. And again, they only fund a certain portion of it, we found quite consistently. So that's a struggle. There's a lot of barriers, but I think you just keep pushing through and have faith. I would also reiterate what you said about getting community consultation. What do your elders want? What's their vision? What's your community's vision for education long-term? We did that, and that was very powerful in our negotiations and very difficult for ISC to have anything to say back about that. So yeah, just keep pushing on, even when you get discouraged. Have a team with you. And I really would like to see this presentation again, and I will be letting Dolores Netmaker from FSIN and see if they can get you guys to present.
I think because we've been working with FSIN on the costing model, and we've been, so it has changed. It just like we're updating the presentation. I think they probably have seen it once, but yeah, but it's been 2 years ago, so like it has like half of the content has changed. So.
Yeah, no, it's excellent, and a lot of the things you presented, I'm like, did you walk beside us on this?
No, we walked beside other people, and we're so like I mean, we've seen also the REA being negotiated, and then you know, First Nations weren't as lucky as you having the lawyer catching things like that, and they were like, oh, our funding protection only applies to certain sections, and now Alberta formula has changed altogether, and their funding is down because ES kind of made it very not like doing the funding protection on the entire amount, but just picking. So, and they didn't, again, that was the last minute change they didn't catch, and they're at a huge disadvantage because of that. So, yeah,
absolutely. Well, and one thing I just want to make note of is that REAs, they don't give you extra money in them. Our collective is, we do ask for additional money to fund in a lot of different areas. And so we weren't satisfied with the REA model that was presented a couple of years ago. Like I said, when we started 7-8 years ago, there was a game plan. ISC changed the rules, another game plan. And so we're using a lot of that against them. And why would we settle just for the same amount of money? It's not meeting our needs. Why would we do it?
I know.
Yeah, so our agreement has a significant amount of an additional ask, which I believe just went to cabinet. So we're just waiting to hear.
Great. Well, thank you for your insights. It's amazing. And just being on this kind of like, I know that we're running out of time. Kind of using the opportunity, we are working on this National Education Transportation Study right now for AFN. So we've been engaged by the AFN, and the idea is to collect data and really understand what those cost drivers that are unique to First Nations, compare them against this provincial comparability concept, and hopefully inform the development of the new transportation funding formula. I mean, we would for sure appreciate if you would want to participate. I mean, we're wrapping up the community engagement, in fact, but I thought if any of you would want to raise your hands and say, talk to us too, we would love that. So yeah, so this is the last poll. Would you like to participate in the AFN a national transportation study? And it's only an interview. We sometimes follow up with some questions around costs as well, but yeah, we certainly would get in touch with you in a short order here if you're interested. And also just kind of not doing another poll questions because I think they're a bit tiring. If you do want us to connect with you, I mean, we're happy to talk. Yeah, our emails are there on one of the first slides. We will be sharing the deck with you as well. So yeah, would be happy to connect. I don't know. I think people are kind of already done with the polls. Yeah, because we had this like, would you like MNP to connect with you? But I'm sure you can, yeah, connect with us if, yeah, through the email information we provided at the beginning of the presentation. So any closing questions or comments?
Okay, well, thank you very much. The hour and a half flew by. I was wondering, what are they going to say for an hour and a half? But it was really interesting.
I was wondering too. I was like, well, that's a lot of that. Yeah.
Well, this is critical, and you're kind of at the front end of it. It's a process that, yeah, it's up and down. So thank you very much for both you and Mac for doing this excellent presentation, and hopefully people will get in contact with you. I think if what are the ways that they can get a hold of you?
I mean, we can, so by email, phone, like we can, what would be the best? We can send that to you, or, and also in our presentation. So there, one of the slides would say our contact information, and we will post the slides.
Yeah, or if anybody wants to get a hold of, oh, there's Mac's
oh,
email, and yours.
Okay.
So
lovely.
Thanks to the chat. It was a real pleasure to listen to you.